I'm Rosa Nieves. Welcome to QPTV's Book Review. I have with me Nicholas Hirshon. He is a college professor at St. John's University and LaGuardia Community College right here in Queens. He is an accomplished journalist, a former reporter for the New York Daily News, as well as the DNA Info News website, which covers Queens news. Nicholas is a graduate of St. John's University with a bachelor's degree in journalism. He also attended the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, graduating with a master's degree in newspaper journalism in 2008. Today we're going to talk about his latest accomplishment, a book entitled Images of America, Forest Hills. This is his second book. His first book was Images of America, Nassau Veterans Memorial Coliseum, which features the premier sports and entertainment arena on Long Island. Nick, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, Nick, I have to congratulate you. I first learned about your book in a Daily News article written by Irvin Dijon entitled Scribe Heads to the Hills. I also learned that you're 27 years old.
Yes.
Now, Nick, you've accomplished so much in such a short time. How were you able to do this, and what inspired you to become a reporter?
I don't know if I've accomplished that much. I think inspired me to become a reporter, that's an easier question. Just when I was a kid, my parents would always bring home the New York Times, the Newsday. Those were the two papers that we always read. And I started to see the importance of news and just the fact that people really cared and they got all their information from buying the Times and Newsday. So I wanted to be that person getting the information and that people would be trusting and looking to for that, want to be responsible for that. So from a very early age, I mean, at least late elementary school, moving on, I always wanted to be a journalist. And I was able to study with some great professors at St. John's and then at Columbia, and it went on from there.
Very nice. Yeah. Now, you mentioned the Times and Newsday, but you ended up working for the Daily News.
Yes.
What was your most interesting article that you covered for the Daily News?
Interesting. Wow, that's a tough one. I don't know, there's a lot of different things that I covered at different points. I got to interview a lot of famous people, and I interviewed David Wright, third baseman with the Mets. I got to interview a bunch of players on the Islanders, who I grew up rooting for the Islanders and the Mets. I guess my favorite story was probably, I did a series called History in Peril in 2008. That was about a bunch of historic sites in Queens that aren't officially city landmarks and probably should be. And if they don't get city landmark status, they could be demolished at any moment or altered significantly. So I was able to really explore, and I like doing research. So I was able to find sites like the house where Jackie Robinson lived when he broke in with the Brooklyn Dodgers and when he won his Rookie of the Year award. He lived in Adderley Park in St. Albans. And the Queens Museum of Art building that used to be home to the United Nations at one period. It was originally built for the 1939 World's Fair. And now it is being altered because they're expanding the Queens Museum of Art and moving into a space that used to be the ice skating rink. But there were just a lot of sites like that. And Queens also had the oldest continuously operated movie theater in the country, the Ridgewood Theater, that closed recently. And that site, because we covered it, ended up getting official city landmark status, so it's protected. So that was a kind of a fun moment to see that your reporting gets something.
Had some sort of result to it.
Sure.
So how did you transition to teaching and becoming a professor?
I guess when I was at St. John's, I first started getting interested in teaching because I had a professor who taught news writing, and he was also a reporter at Newsday. He actually worked editorial, so he was writing opinion pieces. And I saw how he was able to manage his schedule was sort of mind-boggling to me, that he would get up really early in the morning at like 5 o'clock, and he'd like go to the pool, and then he would teach us a class at 7:30 in the morning. So he'd already like been doing all this stuff. We were like still bleary-eyed and getting up. And then he had already like done his whole like thing at the pool, and he was instructing kids, and then he'd teach us, and then he'd go to his job at Newsday and then work a full day. And I was like, power to him. And I also saw the kind of influence that someone like that could have on a young journalist's life. And I think it's sort of the same thing why I got interested in journalism itself, because you can really impact somebody and you really feel like you've helped them, you've made a difference. If it sounds corny, but it's the truth.
It's true. It's true. You make a difference in someone else's life, and you end up being a mentor, and then they follow in the footsteps, which is great and ideal. And that's what a teacher and professor is supposed to do, right?
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about your series. For the first volume of Images of America, you chose Nassau Veterans Memorial Coliseum. Can you give us a little brief overview of that book?
Sure. Well, it was, like you said, it's the first book I'd ever written. And I picked Nassau Coliseum because I grew up as an Islanders fan. I went to the Coliseum all the time, but it was another one of those buildings, like a lot of the ones in Queens, that I felt doesn't get a lot of attention and actually gets all the negative attention, where people say it's outdated. And it was built in 1972, and it hasn't really changed at all since.
And they've talked about revamping it for years.
Right.
Right?
Right. I mean, it's been going on. I was looking at newspaper articles at the time I was writing the book, where in like the early 90s and the late 80s, they're already starting to say, like, we need to add in this. And they did minor things, but for the most part, the way it looks outside and inside is very similar to when it opened. And in the modern age of sports, where stadiums have a very short lifespan and then you got to get the new one. So no one really looked into, I felt, the history of the Coliseum, because I realized that even though, yeah, maybe it's not the prettiest arena, the Islanders won 4 Stanley Cups there in a row, and that's, you know, a dynasty team with Hall of Fame players, and I thought that was really exciting. And then they had all these other kind of small sports teams that played there: lacrosse, indoor soccer, arena football, circuses, concerts by Paul McCartney and big acts, and then political campaign speeches by President Nixon and President Ford.
Wow, I didn't even remember that.
Yeah, I thought it was terrific. And not only were they campaign speeches, but it was right before the election. So like the eve of these elections, they picked Nassau Coliseum to make like big speeches to like rally the troops right before. So I thought it was interesting to look into that.
Very nice, very nice. Now for your second book, I read that you grew up in Queens and in Forest Hills. Is that why you chose Forest Hills for your second book?
Yeah, I mean, when I wrote the Nassau Coliseum book, a lot of people were saying, really, Nassau Coliseum? Like, your whole thing is Queens, and you grew up in Queens, and you write about Queens for the Daily News. So I wanted to go to my hometown. Forest Hills is where I've born and raised. So since I grew up there, I figured this would be a great opportunity to really explore the neighborhood. And I knew some things I wanted to touch on, like the history of the U.S. Open there and Forest Hills Gardens, but I also knew there would be a lot to learn, and it would be fun to look back at photos of the school that I went to, the pizzeria on the corner, those kinds of local landmarks, and see it from like 40, 50, 100 years ago.
Now I see that the foreword was done by, or written by, Ray Romano. How did that happen? How did you accomplish that?
It was, I was very excited when that came through. Well, I realized that to legitimize the book, it would be great to have a celebrity who has some connection to Forest Hills. And at first I thought about some of the players for the tennis. And I thought maybe someone who'd won the U.S. Open, a John McEnroe, a Chris Everett, someone like that who had played there. But I started out my wish list really with Ray Romano, because in Queens, in Forest Hills, he's like a local legend, and his photos in like every pharmacy and law office and movie theater, and like he's a favorite son of Forest Hills. And still very popular and in pop culture all the time. I was watching The Office the other day, and he was on the show. So I just made it my work, like a reporter would, to find out how am I going to get through to him, and called around a million different agencies and publicists, and finally got the right guy, who was very, very kind. His name is Rory Rosegarden. And he just gave me a lot of his time and said, you know, Ray will consider it. And then, you know, a few days later, he said, okay, Ray's going to do it, because I think he felt the connection that, you know, Ray Romano seems like someone who really still appreciates where he came from, unlike some people kind of want to forget. Yeah. And so he was very willing to do that and describe probably stuff that he's never talked about before, because, you know, people may have asked him questions, but not about really specific neighborhood kind of questions.
His roots.
Yeah.
Now, Ray Romano speaks passionately about what he considers his start in comedy as a teenager. Can you tell us about that backstory in your book?
Sure. So Ray Romano obviously grew up in Forest Hills, and he was describing this to me on the phone when we were discussing the forward, and it's a really good story about how at that time when he was growing up, Saturday Night Live had just sort of come out. It was really big, and he decided that he wanted to do this little skit with some of his friends from school. So they had a teen club at the local church, Our Lady of Mercy Church on Kessel Street. And he decided that he and his friends were going to do this little stand-up routine, and they parodied people in the neighborhood and all of this stuff. And he describes being really nervous about looking out in this crowd and seeing girls that he liked and bullies he was afraid of, and parents of friends and all this stuff. And he was able to get them to laugh. And it was kind of his first moment. I guess all comedians have the moment of like, wow, something I said made an audience laugh. So that was the first time that Ray Romano really did comedy, was in the basement of Our Lady of Mercy Church, which happens to be my home parish. And I went to Our Lady of Mercy School, which is right next door.
Very nice.
So there's a nice connection there too.
Now, how did you gather all the information for your book? How did you put it all together?
Well, with a book like this, you have to really work on photos and kind of work backwards. There were certain things that I knew I wanted to touch on, but in order to do that, I kind of needed a photo of it in order to do that. And that made it difficult because there were some things I really wanted to emphasize, but if I couldn't get that great image, then it wasn't going to work out. So I went to all the sources from when I was a reporter. I contacted the local community board, the Forest Hills Gardens Corporation, which operates the gardens, a bunch of libraries, archives around the country, and sort of culled the best stuff together, and some cases the cheaper things together, because some of these archives are charging a lot of money for photos.
That's right.
But I put the best stuff together, and then I kind of developed themes, and I made sure that I touched on the major things I wanted to get into anyway.
Okay, and you mentioned the Sage Foundation, and in the book you talk about the Sage Foundation and the modern Garden of Eden. Give us a time frame and a little background of the Sage Foundation.
Sure. So the Sage Foundation is named after Russell Sage, who was a railroad magnate. And when he died in early 1900s, he left a huge endowment to his wife, Olivia Margaret Sage. And they decided that they were going to use this for some sort of philanthropic endeavor. And they wanted to spread it out across a lot of different places where the Sages had homes and businesses and things. But really, I think the most lasting legacy from Sage is Forest Hills Gardens. So around this era, and we're talking about 1908, 1909, they decide to purchase a lot of land in what has recently been branded Forest Hills, named after Forest Park. Before then it was known as White Pot. And they want to make a model community in an era where a lot of people are living in tenements in New York City, and it's squalid and everyone's cramped and it's dirty. And they had these renderings of a very airy space, greenery, Tudor-style houses, architecture that's inspired by Europe and England and Germany and those kinds of places. So they put this together, and they start to attract a lot of residents who want a little bit of a closeness to the city. So they have that proximity, so they could travel into the city to do business in Manhattan, but then they can come to the suburb and have this beautiful Garden of Eden, Arcadia kind of community.
Very nice. Now, in your book, you also touch upon Theodore Roosevelt. Can you tell us, why did Theodore Roosevelt come to Queens?
A lot of people don't know. And even after I wrote the introduction to this book, which is all about Theodore Roosevelt speaking at the Forest Hills train station, it's still kind of unclear, because at the time that he came to Forest Hills Gardens, it was July 4th, 1917. America had just entered World War I. And he was obviously a hawk. He wanted to get involved in the war even earlier, very patriotic. And a bunch of different places had reached out to former president at that time, Roosevelt, to get him to speak. And he was battling malaria at the time. He had his sons all in combat and a lot on his mind, and it's just not really physically doing so hot. But for whatever reason, he decides to come to Forest Hills, which is not that far from Oyster Bay, where he was living in Long Island, Sagamore Hill, which is a National Historic Landmark. And there are some speculation about him having a friend in Forest Hills Gardens who invited him, but I think he just wanted the opportunity to have a bully pulpit, which is a term that he coined, to actually go out on 4th of July with all the bunting and the huge crowd whooping it up for him. I think he just enjoyed that kind of atmosphere, and that's probably one of the reasons. And at that time, Forest Hills Gardens was making a lot of headlines. This new model community, people were curious, what is it going to last? What's it all about? So maybe he was just curious himself to see it.
Very nice. Well, there's a quote in the book that I would like you to read.
Okay.
Now, it's on page 11, so go to page 11.
All right.
So it's a quote from Theodore Roosevelt on page 11.
Yep.
And it's known as his 100% American speech. Can you give me the backstory and read that quote? Because I thought that was very intense myself.
Sure. Well, the entire speech is intense. You can actually find the video on YouTube, and there's no audio to it, but you can just see if like he's like constantly moving his fists and like leaning over, and he's really like into whatever he's saying. And I read the text of the speech, but he thought that America should have entered the war earlier. He was very unhappy with the president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, and he actually had asked Wilson to let him lead a charge into France and fight, and Wilson kind of just pushed him aside and said, like, you're some old guy, what do you know? But Roosevelt took this really personally. So when he makes this speech in Forest Hills Gardens, he's advocating for a very strong allegiance to America and speaking, I guess, especially to German immigrants who he feels might be kind of have mixed allegiances here, where like they're living in the United States, but the mother country, and they're thinking about their homeland. So that's, I guess, the quote that you're talking about here, where he says, quote, "We can have no 50-50 allegiance in this country. Either a man is an American and nothing else, or he's not American at all." And that's what led to the 100% American speech title. And I think it's a very strong quote, and just even reading it in text, I couldn't see him actually speaking it, but you can see the kind of power that has to it, and the whole passion and patriotism of Teddy Roosevelt.
Can you tell us about some other notable people that were in Forest Hills at that time and now?
Sure. Well, and now,
We have a lot.
There's a lot of people who have at some point come to Forest Hills, especially since there's the U.S. Open connection. So many presidents have visited just to go to the Open, or so many, of course, famous athletes were there. Some of the ones that come to mind most notably, Helen Keller lived in Forest Hills for a good portion of her life in a house that was sadly demolished. It was on Seminole Avenue, which is now 112th Street. It's kind of parallel to the Grand Central. And it was demolished to make way for a Jewish synagogue. But there's a little plaque that you don't really know about, and even though I lived in Forest Hills for so long and passed that a million times going to and from Mets games and stuff. But there's a little plaque on the door that says that she lived there, and I think that's a shame because she's an international icon, and if her house was still around, and it was a beautiful medieval kind of looking house.
They could have made it a museum.
Yeah, I think it's so sad when you go to other parts of the country and you see, like, honestly, relatively minor people who have their own little museum, and then you think like Helen Keller, like the miracle worker, like somebody who has inspired so many people, and the American Foundation for the Blind. So she's one that really comes to mind. And then there are a bunch of famous people who went to Forest Hills High School. One of the photos I have in the book is the yearbook photo of Jerry Springer, who went to Forest Hills High, which is kind of like a fun little thing.
Now, you mentioned tennis. Why did tennis come to Forest Hills? Why Forest Hills?
It was kind of a mixture of the right timing and serendipity and all of that. In 1912, the West Side Tennis Club, which was originally on the west side of Manhattan, decided that they needed a new home because its members wanted more space, and they wanted to maybe shoot for national tournaments and things that they weren't going to get at their current location. So they had these meetings, and they were picking between originally the Queens in the Bronx. They voted for Queens, and then they were deciding between Forest Hills and Kew Gardens. And I think Forest Hills, because there had already been publicity about Forest Hills Gardens, it was getting hot. People were wondering, just like Roosevelt, what is this community all about? It was spacious, close to the city, had a railroad station so you could get back and forth easily. So they decide they're going to buy this land. And then a few years into their time there, they start advocating for the national championships, which would become the U.S. Open. And at the time, the U.S. Open was held in Newport, Rhode Island, at a stadium known as the Casino. But there was a feeling in tennis that a lot of the fans who, quote-unquote fans, who came to Newport really didn't care about the tennis. They were there to socialize and mingle, and they were sort of these polite, little clap kind of fans. And maybe if you brought it to New York, you'd get the kind of, not completely rowdy, but more passionate kind of fans that they ended up getting. So that's how it started.
Okay. Now, what do you want people to take away from your book?
I guess whether you're from Forest Hills or just you've never been here, that there's a lot of history that went on here. And I know you can say that about almost any neighborhood, but I think Forest Hills is really unique in terms of the amount of history, the kinds of events, the importance of things like the first garden community in the country at Forest Hills Gardens, and the U.S. Open for so many years at the West Side Tennis Club. And also, what I'd like, my inner preservationist would like people to kind of realize that some of this stuff is disappearing.
And you have to cherish it and try to keep it around.
For sure. I mean, the West Side Tennis Club, the stadium where they played all those years, is crumbling right now. And there's talk about, are they going to demolish it or sell it? And I think maybe people just don't appreciate the history of it, especially when you have newer immigrants coming in and a whole generation like mine who wasn't alive at the time when the U.S. Open was even going on there, so you start to forget. And
don't realize its importance.
Yeah. So I think that would be one thing that I hope people look at this and they see, wow, some of these sites have remained exactly the same, and then they'll look and they'll be like, oh man, that thing looked really pretty. I wish that, you know, Helen Keller's house was still here, or some of the other things that are in there.
Now, you mentioned Community Board 6 helped you with gathering all the pictures. Who else helped with this project?
So Community Board 6 was a huge help because I called the district manager and I asked him if he had any photos, Frank Galucio, and I thought, you know, maybe he said, oh, I have like a few things. I thought he would like take off something off his wall. And then I show up and he has like a file cabinet full of like hundreds and hundreds of photos, which was amazing for me. So I spent hours there going through stuff. The Forest Hills Gardens Corporation was pretty much the same way. And what's terrific about them is they've cataloged every single newsletter from the beginning of Forest Hills Gardens. So you can actually go there, and I did, and like touch the newsletter from when Teddy Roosevelt visited. And you know, I'm touching things from like 1906, 1907, you know, the original newsletter, and see how are people thinking at this time. You know, and I also used a lot of databases online, going to the New York Times, but I'd say Community Board 6 and Forest Hills Gardens Corporation were a huge help, in addition to, you know, lots of other friends who loaned me a scanner to scan in photos and gave me different leads on where I could find images.
Now, just to give our viewers a little teaser, I'm going to want you to show our viewers just a couple of pictures that you think are, I know you love them all, okay?
That's why
that are great in the book.
Them.
So just a couple, and we'll get close-ups on them.
All right, this is going to be tough now. Put me on the spot to see which are some of the best ones.
We know they're all great.
Yeah, let's see, we have a lot here in Forest Hills Gardens. I mean, this is an interesting one that, I mean, I'm sure that you'll get a better graphic of this. But this is an ad from Forest Hills Gardens Corporation from when they first opened, or the Sage Foundation when they first opened Forest Hills Gardens. And what I thought was interesting about it is I found it at the Queens Historical Society. And one of the things that it says in there is that we want people to know Forest Hills Gardens is not a philanthropic only pursuit. We actually expect people to pay into it because the Sage Foundation had a reputation for being so charitable that they worried people would think like, oh, they're just giving away homes. And no, that's not what it was. Actually, they want to attract the kind of people who are there now. Business people, the elite, the upper crust. So reading kind of the text of this was really fun.
Oh, okay.
I know it's not a great necessarily image, but that's just something that stood out to me. This actually is probably one of, if not the oldest building in all of Forest Hills, which is not very impressive considering some of the other buildings that are famous in Forest Hills, but it's now home to Cohen's Fashion Optical. It's at the corner of Austin Street and Continental Avenue. And it's just kind of fun to see that that building is still looking exactly the same way today as it did here when it's a dirt path and there's nothing else much going on.
Now, you're a professor and mentor to students at St. John's University and LaGuardia Community College. What is the biggest challenge that they face today to become a reporter or author after college to accomplish the same goals that now you've accomplished?
It's incredibly difficult. It's so super competitive out there. And at least when I was at St. John's going to college, getting my bachelor's, there was kind of a distinct path that you took where you worked at a small town newspaper for a few years and then you worked your way up to a bigger newspaper and all this kind of stuff. And now the whole newspaper industry is dying. And
a lot of things are going web-based, am I right?
It's all web.
Web and television.
And social media. So you have to learn Twitter and Facebook and learn it not just for personal, my boyfriend hates me, hashtag, epic fail or something, but actually having like a journalistic discussion, tweeting out links to your story. So I think that's the toughest thing for them to find their place in this media environment. And I tell them all the time, it's about enthusiasm and passion. Like if you want to do whatever it is you want to do, there'll be a place for you in the world. But if you're one of those people who's kind of like, well, I'm sort of interested in writing news and I only want to write about my favorite band and I don't only want to write about my favorite actor, there's no space for that. Or you might be doing it on your own blog and no one's going to read it. So I think you've just got to be enthusiastic, excited about the future of it, because it is still exciting that people are relying on you for information. You can change the outcome of situations based on what you're doing.
Okay. Is there anything else you would like to add about your book?
I think that whether you're from Forest Hills or you've never been here, there's something to be learned here. I really went all out with that introduction to the book, describing the circumstances around Teddy Roosevelt's visit, because I thought it's one of those moments in Forest Hills history that people know about. They know that he visited, and there's even a mural in the TD Bank on Metropolitan Avenue at Continental that shows him giving this speech in Forest Hills Gardens, but people maybe don't really know the circumstances, what brought it about, and some of the specific quotes. What did he say? So that's one of the things I think is really exciting about it.
Thank you. That's very good. Thank you so much, Nick,
Thank
for
you very
joining
much.
me. That's it for today's program. If you missed any part of the show, just go to www.qptv.org and check the program guide for more listings of QPTV's book review. I'm Rosalind Nieves. Thank you.